Hello, I'm Jake Stone.
I'm Jesse Owens.
We welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We're a show by Baptist, about Baptist, and for Baptist, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and yes, even an Anabaptist, though we hope none from Munster. I'm a Calvinist Baptist. Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have been known as Particular Baptist and General Baptist. And so we brought together in what we think is a fun way to form Generally Particular. Now, you may notice that last time we met, there was no video. Our discussion on Baptist and confessionalism, and that is because yours truly, in the eyes of some people, is a techno dinosaur. And so the issue was on my end. And so I am sorry for that. Hopefully, we have fixed the problems. I restarted my phone and my laptop before we began this episode. We also want to remind you that we did spend the last several weeks looking at Baptist history and theology and identity, kind of establishing what does it mean to be a Baptist, that there really is a real Baptist identity and theology. Today, we want to talk about things outside the Baptist world, and that is about Protestant theologians that we are thankful for. So our episode today is entitled, Let Us Give Thanks. Now, I will say that in this spirit of charity and Catholicity, some recent people on social media have really damaged that by bringing out the old trope that Baptists are essentially Anabaptist. And it's just kind of one of those little smears that gets thrown out there at times that can kind of make me angry. Now, we know that Jesse embraces being an Anabaptist because, after all, Arminians have so many issues. And so why not add that one on? Isn't that right, Jesse?
Yeah, I don't think that's exactly right, but we'll roll with it. I do have my favorite Dutch Reformed theologian here in my coffee cup today.
Well, we know that some people might wonder what terminology you're using when you say Reformed. But all kidding aside, one thing that we want to stress is that to be denominational and confessional does not mean that we have to be sectarian and tribal. Too many kind of equate those as if you're really emphatic and you hold to distinctives, such as we've looked at. What does it mean to be a Baptist? Then that means that you have to be someone who builds walls. And that's not what we were after. So J.V. Vesco, who is a Presbyterian, in his book that I'm reading through right now, it's a great little resource called The Need for Creeds Today, not the need for speed, but the need for creeds, puts it well when he writes, to be good neighbors, we should maintain our confessional fences, but do so in a spirit of love and theological. How do you say this, Jesse?
Irenicism.
Irenicism, yeah. Thank you. Always open to dialoguing and willing to remove fences if we find that they are unbiblical or unnecessary. So kind of what provoked me and Jesse to wanting to do an episode on men that we're thankful for who are outside of our tradition, our Baptist tradition, is when we're recording this episode, it's just been a few days since Harry Reeder and Tim Keller, who are two great leaders in the Presbyterian Church, passed away, as well as Donald MacLeod, who was of the Free Church of Scotland. For us as two Baptists, it calls us to stop and think about how much we owe and are grateful for brothers outside of our tradition. So in our episode today, we desire to show forth a spirit of Catholicity in giving thanks for some men of various Protestant streams over the last 100 years who have been used greatly in our lives. So what do you think of that, Jesse? Are we compromising our Baptist?
Well, Considering one of the first comments on even the concept of this show was that we were being unnecessarily divisive by having a podcast or show that was dedicated entirely to Baptists, I think it's good that we do this. And obviously, what we're trying to do here is explore the Baptist tradition, look at the whole Baptist story. But certainly, or hopefully, no one construes that as thinking we don't think that there's a great amount of insight from the rest of the tradition, and we see that even in Baptist writings and Baptist theology. Again, the good folks over at the Center for Baptist Renewal, I think, have done some excellent stuff demonstrating that, and we feel the same way. So we're trying to look at the whole Baptist story, but we're incredibly thankful for, and I think shaped as individuals, as those who have pastored churches in a variety of ways, our preaching, all sorts of ways, are shaped by those who are not Baptists.
Yeah, and that's why today, I mean, it's one reason I tried to dress up. I'm really trying to honor others, and in the spirit of this Catholicity, I'm wearing my Banner of Truth tie. And let me just say, at the beginning, if there's another group organization that I really am grateful for and feel very indebted to, is the Banner of Truth. Still, probably the best conference that I've ever attended is the Banner of Truth East Coast Conference that I was able to go to 4 years ago. Just great men, great fellowship, and they have done so much to get us good literature in our hands.
Oh man, when you think about Puritan paperbacks, you think about Ian Murray stuff, so many other things that they've reprinted. Yeah. I mean, Banner of Truth is fantastic. Absolutely.
The first book that I ever gave Jesse as a gift was a Banner book from the Banner Conference when I came back.
I appreciated that.
He's never read it though.
But I did appreciate you giving it to me.
Yes. We all have a bad habit of, we get the books and then they go on the shelf. So we'll try to do better with that. So let's talk about Presbyterians for a minute. Let's start there, kind of talking about. So who are some important Presbyterian voices and influences in your life?
Yeah, I mean, we can run through a list of folks, and I think we probably should mention, several names. Some of the ones that I immediately thought about, two of you've already mentioned, thinking about Tim Keller, thinking about Harry Reeder, and then for me, J. Gresham Machen would be really high on that list as well. Sometimes I tell students, other than the Bible, Machen's Christianity and Liberalism is probably the book I've read more than any other book, and has really informed the way I think about the relationship between history and doctrine, and the necessity of the historicity of the things recorded in the Gospels, and all of those sorts of things. I've been really influenced by that book. Thinking about Tim Keller and Harry Reeder dying recently, towards the end of last week, Keller in particular, during college, there isn't an author that I read more than Tim Keller and listened to his sermons. I bought every book he published. If he spoke somewhere nearby, I would go hear him speak. When visiting New York City with friends on an occasion, we obviously visited a Redeemer. But I think some things that stood out to me most about Keller in particular were in his preaching, the way that he always got to Christ. His sermons were always geared towards preaching Christ. And related to that, I remember a series of lectures recorded with he and Edmund Clowney that I think are still available online, that you can find somewhere, on preaching Christ. And they're just so good. But I was also amazed in his preaching and in his writing, the way that he defended Christianity in a coherent and powerful way, ways that were compelling to me as a relatively even new believer, but I think to unbelievers as well. But also in his writing in particular, how he engaged a wide array of literature. It was because of reading Tim Keller that I read Flannery O'Connor, which I really enjoyed Flannery O'Connor's writings. It was because of Tim Keller that I was already reading C.S. Lewis, but kind of wanted to read C.S. Lewis even more. So Keller had a huge impact on me. And then thinking about Harry Reeder. The first time I ever heard Harry Reeder speak was probably close to 10 or 15 years ago, when he spoke on the campus of Welch College. Let's see, that would have been about 15 years ago when I was a student. And it was at a Bible conference, and he's introduced as being a pastor in the PCA. And then I heard him preach, and I thought, there's never been a more Baptist sounding Presbyterian preacher that I've ever heard, which
And that's what
was kind of
Jesse said. Hey, man.
that's right. I started waving my hanky. Um, and then Reeder told this really funny story about how he actually got his start in ministry in a Free Will Baptist church in Greenville, North Carolina, which I thought was incredible. To an incredible story to hear. My dad really. My dad really fell in love with the ministry of Harry Reeder and his books and his podcasts and his sermons and so much of what he did. And last year, actually, my dad went on a trip with Harry Reeder and I think some folks from the Briarwood Church on a trip to Israel, and it was really a life shaping experience for him. And so each of those men in particular, and so many others could be mentioned, but Machen, Keller, and Reeder definitely have had a big impact on me.
Well, I think some people would say that if maybe listening, that if Harry Reeder could start off at a Free Will Baptist church and end up in the PCA, there may be hope for you yet, Jesse. But I do want to say to our audience that Jesse has shown that he truly should be considered a part of the Reformed family. That he went to New York City and went to Tim Keller's church and not to Fosdick's church there in New York City. So we can say that.
Yeah, Fosdick wasn't there anymore. Oddly enough, though, I have been to the Presbyterian church that Fosdick pastored. Oddly enough, even though he was a Baptist, and I went there with Michael Haken and Greg Wills. So just let that sink in.
The three amigos there together. So
that's right. That's right.
And I think about Presbyterian, first of all, I mean, even just as a student, and you can testify to this as well, being an alumnus of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, that we owe much to the Presbyterian tradition, our own nation, particularly from Princeton. I mean, James P. Boyce was trained by the Hodges, and that whole tradition really impacts what comes out at Southern in its founding in the mid-19th century. I think, of course, R.C. Sproul is somebody who really transcended in many ways denominational boundaries in his impact through Ligonier. I can still remember going to the Ligonier conference, the national conference in 2014. If any of our audience has ever heard or seen the famous clip or meme or GIF of R.C. Sproul saying, "What's wrong with you people?" I was there in the audience for that live. Thankfully, though, I did not submit the question that triggered that response from Dr. Sproul. I think now we have to do that. We can do this debate as to which Presbyterians do we wish were Baptist. And
well, that's not, we could do that, but we probably could also ask how many of them actually were Baptists. Sometimes I wonder, is there anyone who's actually just a Presbyterian? I think most of them are just Baptists who wanted the nicer stuff, but.
Jesse is inviting hate mail.
Send that to Jordan Stefaniak at London Lyceum.
Well, we should say when we talk about people outside of the Baptist tradition that we are appreciative of, Jordan would be one of those. Just kidding, President Stefaniak. But I think about Sinclair Ferguson. I remember in 2013, the first ever theological conference that I ever attended outside of the tent that I preached at was the expositor conference that used to be held in Mobile, Alabama at Christ Fellowship Church that Steve Lawson pastored. And they had Sinclair Ferguson come in 2013. And I can still remember how gripped I was when he preached John 14 on the ministry of the Holy Spirit. And it was really the
Mm.
first time in person that I've ever heard theological exposition like that. It was very rich and very powerful. His book, The Whole Christ, which the foreword of that is written by Tim Keller, who was a student of Ferguson's at Westminster for a time, is an excellent book, really helpful on understanding justification, sanctification, the Mara controversy, and so forth. The other Presbyterian that I really wish was a Baptist, although he has been immersed, he has been baptized, per Mark Dever, is Ligon Duncan. Because
Yeah.
Ligon Duncan is the consummate Southern gentleman theologian. And I have one buddy of mine who went to RTS in Jackson. He went as a Baptist and he came out as a Baptist. And I have to say, I've even told him that if anybody has higher cred in the Baptist point score over me, it would be him. Because I think if you can make it through RTS and still hold to your Baptist convictions, you're probably more of a Baptist than I am, because that would be tough. But he said that Ligon Duncan has made many Baptists into Presbyterians. One of the ways is by his kindness, and I think there's
Mm.
much for us to learn and from him. So
You,
very
you mentioned
grateful.
you mentioned Ferguson's theological preaching. Ligon Duncan, in many ways, same thing, right? I
Yeah,
remember hearing him preach a sermon on the atonement and was just, blown away by how moving it was, but also how rich it was theologically. So I think Ferguson and Duncan very very much in the same vein there.
and I think it may have been the first time I ever heard a Ligon Duncan sermon. Was somebody sent me? I think it was at the 2012, or it may have been 2014 T4G sermon he preached on Elijah, and that was very just that season of life for me in pastoral ministry at that point was just very encouraging and very very helpful for me. And I mean, there's other men. Carl Truman, his work, The Creedal Imperative, really good. Michael Horton is someone else who's done great stuff. I've got here on the desk. Um, Christ the Lord, especially people who maybe are familiar with some of the debates that happened over Lord salvation and uh, some of the things with John MacArthur and others. I think this was just a really great book. And then we mentioned it earlier. I mean, Ian Murray. I mean, he is a
Yeah.
Presbyterian, and the work that he's done with the Banner of Truth. I mean, all of the publications that he's written over the years, and just the spirit that is around the man as well. These would just be a sampling of some of the Presbyterian brethren that have been very encouraging to us. Now, let's talk about the Anglicans. The people that jailed us back then. Um, so, we don't want to hold grudges. So, I am very,
We figure after a few centuries we can kind of
yeah,
maybe let up a little bit.
One of the things I remember very vividly was that Southern had a conference at the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. They had a panel, and up there was Ligon Duncan and Mark Dever, and they asked for things that they're thankful for. And Mark Dever turned to Ligon Duncan and said, "Lig, thanks for not drowning us anymore." And Ligon Duncan said, "You're welcome." so, uh, but
Oh
in all
man.
seriousness, both Jesse and I can echo this. We both benefited a lot from Jason Kyle, his
Yeah.
expository comments on the Gospels. Very rich, just very concise, direct, but filled with a lot of great nuggets that are just really,
Mhm.
really good. And if you've never read anything by Ryle, I mean, start there. I mean, just take one of the Gospels and begin reading him through those.
Yeah, I think Simplicity in Preaching is a tiny little book. But it's so good. I recently went back through Simplicity in Preaching, and it is just excellent. There's so many good things in there. And then Thoughts for Young Men is another
Yeah.
short one that is really helpful. That would be worth going through with maybe some younger guys in your church, or something like that. I mean, it's really really excellent.
And then men, I mean, they're a little more contemporary, but I think about another good commentator is Leon Morris. His
Hmm.
works have been very helpful. John Stott, his work on preaching between two worlds, but I have found one of his commentaries that he wrote was written on First John was very helpful. Um, just really a
Hmm.
lot of
That
good
series,
pastoral. Yes,
that
this,
series, The Bible Speaks Today. I mean, that is just an incredible
yeah.
series of
It's
commentaries.
not it's not technical. It's not very it's not going to give you an explanation for everything in a verse, but I do think it gets kind of undervalued a little bit because of it's more concise, but it's very helpful. I mean, concise commentaries, they're theological. I mean, Ryle is theological, those are theological. Kind of can help you see kind of the big picture, because I think
Mm.
in expositional preaching in kind of the reformed vein, we'll put it that way, there's a tendency at times to get way too into the weeds, and you can kind of miss what's the big picture in the passage. And I think those commentaries are helpful to keep, that in mind. At least
Yeah,
that's how I take it.
that series is excellent. And related to that, I want to say a couple of other things about John Stott, but related to that, Derek Kidner would be another one. And in his commentaries on Genesis, the Psalms, I think also Ecclesiastes, but I preach the Psalms fairly regularly, oftentimes in between preaching through various books. I'll take a few weeks and preach several Psalms. And his two volumes on the Psalms are, they are just so rich. I mean, they are technical in ways, but then almost devotional in other ways. I couldn't recommend his two volume commentary series, very small, on the Psalms more. Those are excellent. So Derek Kidner would be another one to mention as well. Regarding John Stott, you mentioned Between Two Worlds. That was one of the early preaching books that I read, and he goes through kind of a history of preaching, which is really good. But then he focuses so much on, and for me, it was kind of like a light bulb turned on as a really young preacher, thinking about the importance of dealing with the text within its context, that ancient context. So setting it rightly within that context, within the ancient world, but then also the necessity of bringing that text to bear in on the lives of our hearers as well, bringing it into, for us into the 21st century. So bridging that gap between those two worlds was huge for me. And then, Stott wrote a lot of other great things, but The Cross of Christ, when I read that, it's a bigger book, but obviously a classic. And I was just struck by the book as a whole. But when he was talking about the substitutionary work of Christ, and a lot of times penal substitution is maligned as being something like cosmic child abuse, and Stott says. Penal substitution is the self substitution of God, and I just remember that hit me, and I say that regularly when preaching the cross, when preaching substitution. It is God putting Himself forward as the substitute for our sins. So the cross of Christ, John Stott, just couldn't recommend it enough.
And then, of course, how can we talk about uh, Anglicans and not talk about J.I. Packer?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading Knowing God with men's group at church, and well, the first chapter begins with a Spurgeon quote, so that lets you know it's going to be good. And but just really reading something that is so theological. I'll tell you what a lot of these men have in common. Whether we're talking about somebody like Spurgeon, of course, he's in the Baptist tradition, but a Ryle, a Packer, somebody we're going to talk about later, Martin Lloyd-Jones. There's a theme in these men is that they had the ability of taking doctrine and theology and bringing it to the person in the pew and explaining it in a way that not just that they could understand the concept, but why it mattered. That all theology really is practical. And when you start thinking about what does it mean that God is immutable, that's not just some concept that's out there, but that has real life implications for me on my hardest and worst days, where I feel just overwhelmed by the world, the devil, and my own flesh. That God loves me and cares for me, and He is for me in Christ Jesus. And so Packer, his work there. He has another work called Growing in Christ, which is really good. About walks through the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, basics of the church life, and it's just a really great intro. And I'll say this, and I encourage our audience, if you're not familiar with this book, because it's not one of his most well known. It's actually the first Packer book I ever read through before knowing God. It's a book that I taught through on Wednesday nights called 18 Words, and it's published. I forget what it was originally published under another title years ago, and Christian Focus republished it under 18 Words. But it's chapters on words that we find in Scripture and that we use in our theological jargon, like justification, election, sin, the devil, and we work through that on Wednesday nights, and it's a really great read to kind of introduce people to terms that we use all the time in the Christian life that some people may not really fully understand what all that means. And again, it's Packer theology distilled and put in a way that anyone can understand. Excellent resource. I highly recommend.
Yeah, Knowing God was one of those key books for me. The concept I come back to again and again, and I talk to students about in sort of first semester theology students, is that distinction between knowing about God and actually knowing God, and the importance of it. And it's something I have to remind myself of, and something I say even in preaching is what we're after as Christians is we're not trying to win a game of theological trivia. Right? The goal is knowing God, not merely knowing more about God. Certainly, knowing more about Him is part of it, but it's not merely knowing Him or knowing about Him. We're after knowing Him. One of the things that you mentioned a moment ago, and is probably related to us, maybe our love for the local church and both being preachers, is not leaving theology or doctrine in abstraction. It's not as if everything has to have some really practical payoff necessarily, but I do think bringing theological truth to bear on the lives of people is so important. And you're right. So many of these men that we're mentioning that we admire do that so well, and I think that that's a key component for what we think is so valuable about their contribution.
So we move from the kind of those affiliated with the Anglican Communion to the Dutch Reformed. And of course, we know that these days, Herman Bavinck is kind of the hot commodity in the evangelical life. But I can say, I don't think that it's necessarily overblown. Bavinck's The Wonderful Works of God is a great, one volume resource. His stuff about Christ in the Old Testament in that book is really just rich, and I think does a great job. It's not a preaching book, but gives you a real good insight into how do we see Christ in the Old Testament. Now, I know that we've got some guys here at Southern. I'm thinking about my buddy Alex Ritchie. Now, he's a Bavinck fanboy. I tease him all the time that he wishes he was born Dutch. But I think that it's, I'm glad that we're seeing these things. His nephew, J.H., I think it's J.H. Bavinck, some of his works are starting to be redone, translating into English and so forth, that have more of a missional component. In fact, the bookstore is selling one now. I think it's called Between the mosque and the synagogue or something. But how does the church, how does Christianity interact with other world religions? And so I think this is exciting to see some of these things getting translated into English and published. Um, what are your thoughts on Bavinck?
Well, seeing as I have had Welch College's set of his Reformed Dogmatics in my office library for probably 7 years now, hopefully no one in there is listening to this episode. I refer to that series or that set quite often. I think one of the things that Keller found so helpful about Bavinck was this connection between sort of the ancient and the modern. There's something in which Bavinck is dealing with the Reformed tradition, but he's also dealing with modernity in our modern setting. And so that is one of the things that's probably most helpful about Bavinck.
And then, I mean, in our current moment, Joel Beakey has been someone who has, again, transcended denominational boundaries to serve the church through Reformation heritage books. And I would say someone, it can sometimes be hard for, Baptist publications to, be done by publishing houses that are more maybe Presbyterian or, just Paedo Baptist. And Joel Beakey in Reformation Heritage Books has often, published some works from Baptist. I mean, for example, the great little work on Benjamin Keach on justification, where he rips Richard Baxter to shreds. Joel Beakey wrote a really great foreword to that work, and his got it right here is Puritan Theology, Doctrine for Life, that he co-wrote with Mark Jones. I would have some critiques for some of the Baptist covenant theology stuff in there, but other than that, really great resource, and has done a marvelous job of helping us retrieve, but then also just a very sweet, godly spirit about him and his attitude towards those that are outside of the Dutch Reformed communion.
Yeah, I think I'm not a Beakey expert per se, but I do think his those essays that were written in honor of him, the Festschrift that Hagen and Smalley edited, Puritan Piety, is really good. And if you want to get a general sense of some of the major themes in Beakey's writings, I think Puritan Piety is a good place to look as maybe kind of a primer on what he's written.
And the Reformed systematic theology that he's doing with Paul Smalley. I mean, those are really great resources and very helpful. And again, I do appreciate in the systematic version that there was attention given space to historic Baptist covenant theology. And I really appreciated that. That's not usually can be found. And I was grateful, and I thought it was accurate the way that was handled in there. Now, this kind of group we've labeled as independent.
Wait, that means something different for you. That means something different for your people, Jay.
This is not independent Baptist. All right. So this,
although
is not,
some of them might be Baptistic.
Might be Baptistic. So let's kind of talk about Martin Lloyd-Jones. Martin Lloyd-Jones is indeed, I mean, what? Preaching and Preachers, great book, very helpful. Yeah. I think a must read for those committed to expository preaching, so that you don't become a lecturer, which is you're a preacher. And I think Lloyd-Jones, his where do I begin? His stuff on 1 John was helpful. Of course, we know Romans, Ephesians, Philippians. I would say something that I go back to many times. Of course, there was controversy in Lloyd-Jones's life, his relationship with John Stott, J.I. Packer, things that Lloyd-Jones said about the Anglican Church. But Lloyd-Jones was not a controversialist. He was convictional, and he stood his ground, but he never did so in a mean-spirited way. And if our audience has never read the article that the Gospel Coalition did, I think it was 2 years ago, on Martin Lloyd-Jones and T.T. Shields. T.T. Shields was a very influential leader among Canadian Baptists during the fundamentalist modernist controversy. T.T. Shields was called by some the Canadian Spurgeon. But what happened, if you trace his ministry out, short version, he was standing against heresy that was starting to make its way among Canadian Baptists, but then he became very much a fundamentalist. I mean, he had a relationship with J. Frank Norris, and his ministry became somewhat vindictive about people that did not agree with him. Anybody's ever read Ordinary Pastor by D.A. Carson? Carson's father fell out of favor with Shields because he disagreed with him on some matters. And the article really talks about Lloyd Jones coming and pulling Shields to the side and rebuking him in a loving way, but saying, your ministry used to be this and now it's this. And it's the sad thing is, Shields goes and talks to his confidants about what Lloyd Jones said because tears came into his eyes when Lloyd Jones rebuked him. But by that point, T.T. Shields had surrounded himself with yes men who told him just keep doing what you're doing, which is the danger of fundamentalism. But I think it's a lesson that Lloyd Jones was not some moderate squish, as people like to use that terminology these days. You can be convictional, but be loving and caring about others and have a spirit of humility. And I think, and of course, Banner of Truth is connected with Martin Lloyd Jones. And by the way, in his Puritan conferences that he had, I mean, Lloyd Jones did some, referred to men like Keach and Kiffin and Gill. Not exactly, usually being named in some of those circles. And so I appreciate very much the ministry of Lloyd Jones.
If you go and you listen to Lloyd Jones's sermons, and you can find, so many of them on MLJ Trust. Yeah, you mentioned in Preaching and Preachers, the way that he does describe preaching as logic on fire. And so there is a sense in which it is intellectual, it is theological, but it's aimed at the heart. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to his preaching, you hear that. And there's actually a recording of some lectures he gave that correspond to that book. I think it was at Westminster Theological Seminary, and you can listen to those. And it really comes across so well in there. So I would encourage you to read the book if you haven't, but listen to his lectures on that. And he actually saves the last chapter of the book to deal with unction. But it's just amazing.
That sounds like independent Baptist there now.
Yeah, see, now we're getting into independent Baptist. If you listen to his sermons, I mean, some of them are decades and decades ago, and it is so relevant even in the 21st century in America. The types of skepticism and things that he's dealing with are just so helpful. I was going through my paternal grandfather's personal library a few years ago when he was moving into an assisted living facility. And I was looking through his personal library, and to come across Lloyd Jones's The Plight of Man and the Power of God was just really neat. And to have his copy and his markings in it, and to have that in my personal library, and then to be able to read it, there's so much in Lloyd Jones to admire.
Three things really quick. Four things. I'm thinking about Lloyd Jones. If you've never seen the documentary Logic on Fire about Lloyd Jones' life, just excellent, really well done. Number one, I mean, he wore his tie and suit coat to the beach. Number two, he loved watching wrestling. That is just in my mind. I mean, Westminster Chapel, Lloyd Jones watching wrestling with the grandkids. That's just fascinating to me.
So he took those robes off and that gown off, and then he went and watched wrestling.
Yes. Number three, you can go to YouTube and there are recordings of the hymns being sung at Westminster when he pastored there. You can hear him singing because he's by the mic. I mean, he was not a great singer, but I just find it encouraging to hear when preachers and pastors sing. And you can tell he may not have musical talent, but it was from the heart. And then there was one more thing that I was going to say about him
It's hard to remember a fourth point when you're so used to
When
preaching
I'm used to
3-point sermons,
three. Yeah. I remember what it is now. I can't remember which book it is. If for some reason it's sticking in my mind that sermons that he preached on Ezekiel, but that ranks up there with the weirdest book cover. It's got Godzilla on the front of it. From I can't remember who published that, but that
If
ranks
you
as
can
one of.
just if you can just carry the show for a few minutes, I'm going to Google that.
Okay. And so it's just, I can't remember which one, but it's on the strangest book covers. Another independent, and I put this as kind of like evangelical, because I was not able to identify which actual denomination he was a part of, but Jerry Bridges, who was for years connected with the Navigators. Let me just say, anything that you read from Jerry Bridges is good. His book, Trusting God, is an excellent resource on thinking through when difficulties come in life. I've heard it said one time, it's not a book that you'd give somebody when they're necessarily going through the trial, but it's one that everybody should be familiar with and read that helps prepare us for trials. Now I put this man on the independent list because someone that I know who's interned for him said this is where I should put him. So I want to claim him, but so I'm just following what my buddy told me. But we would have to say Alistair Begg. Now, I like to tease people and say that Sinclair Ferguson, Alistair Begg, and I all have something in common. We have distinct accents. And so when you listen to Alistair Begg preach, I don't know if I've ever heard a bad sermon from him. And I remember in 2014, that conference in Mobile, they had him, and he preached on Christ as prophet, priest, and king. What I love about Alistair Begg is not just that he's a good preacher. I know through a good friend of mine that he is a real pastor. He's not somebody that's caught up in the celebrity stuff, that he has a very pastoral heart, and that he doesn't take himself too seriously. And there's very much a spirit of warmth and humor that I think a lot of people in the quote unquote reformed world are lacking in many ways. And I think too, I don't know if Jesse wants to share this or not, but Jesse sometimes asks me preaching questions, and he asked me this past week, should he include a line from a Johnny Cash song?
Yeah.
And I told him,
said, Jake, is it okay if I quote these lines from Johnny Cash in my sermon? What do you think?
And my response was that if Alistair Begg can quote the Beatles in a sermon, then you can quote the Man in Black. So.
And I did. That was all the encouragement I needed.
But I will say, I think only Alistair Begg can get away with quoting the Beatles in a sermon, I think.
Well, I didn't quote the Beatles, so I quoted Johnny Cash. There are, I don't think there are any living preachers that I listen to their preaching more regularly than Alistair Begg. And I kind of laugh sometimes because if you've had preaching classes in seminary or at a Christian college or something like that, there are all these rules, and recommendations that are given on crafting sermon points and things like that. And then I listen to an Alistair Begg sermon and I'm blown away by it. And then I think in retrospect, that was not a good sermon outline by any of the rules that I was ever taught in a preaching class. It wasn't a good outline at all, but it was an incredible sermon that dealt faithfully with the text. And there's something in there probably for us to learn. One of the reasons I find Alistair Begg's sermons so gripping, beyond all of the music references, you'll like this, Jake. I don't know, it's probably a couple of years ago, I heard him reference a line from, who was it? Ray Stevens. He referenced a Ray Stevens song. It wasn't the comedic Ray Stevens songs that maybe you're familiar with.
The Squirrel Revival in Pascagoula.
Yeah, no. It wasn't any of that. It was "You Better Take Care of Business, Mr. Businessman." You should look that one up if you don't remember it. But here's what I find so incredible about many of Alistair Begg's sermons. You're sitting there listening, and he's preaching on the, let's say, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, those Pharisees, those are some sorry folks, and you're just ready to pound on the Pharisees. And there's that kind of Nathan to David moment where he turns it on the hearer, and it's that "you're the man" kind of moment. And you've kind of let your guard down because you're ready to kind of take aim at somebody else, and then he brings it home to you. And I don't know, I really appreciate Alistair Begg, and certainly his preaching. Of course, he's written a lot of great things too.
One thing that's what I'm going to say. One thing that's interesting though is he's not published a whole lot, which I think is very interesting when you think about kind of the scope of his ministry and how long he has been in ministry, and yet he's been very selective. And I think there's probably something instructive about that. He's very good friends with Sinclair Ferguson, and I think it's very much. And my good friend of mine said that one reason that Alistair Begg would want to be kind of called independent this way is that he's also a huge. Lloyd Jones is one of the biggest influences, and he feels kind of the same way. Lloyd Jones was not big on labels and things, and that's for a whole nother conversation for another day. But I think that what I want to encourage our audience to do, if you're watching this in the comments section, is you should all encourage Jesse to now quote a song by the group Alabama in a sermon. So we're going to either go with Dixieland Delight or Song of the South. So you tell Jesse which one of those two he should incorporate somehow in his next sermon.
We tried to get Alabama, an Alabama song, as the intro to Generally Particular, but it turns out
President Stefaniak was not able to do that. So
it turns out you need a lot of money to be able to do that.
But please donate to us so that we could upgrade our intro music. and then we
that's come to worthy investment.
Yeah, exactly. It's how it starts. It matters. And then we talk about Methodist. Are there any good Methodists out there? Well, there are. So I did not know anything about Thomas Oden until Brandon Askew really recommended his biography. And Thomas Oden is a very fascinating story of someone really that you don't see this very often, as somebody who was in the theological liberal camp and moved to, orthodoxy, confessional orthodoxy in his life. And now I was going to say something, but that might be too spicy for our show. So I'll leave that for Jesse on the after show. But Thomas Oden is a really good example. Fred Sanders, comes out of is in the Wesleyan tradition, doing a lot of great stuff on the Trinity. Jesse has told me before that Fred Sanders is every Reformed Baptist's favorite Methodist. And so
I'm not sure they even know he is a Wesleyan. It's like they're like, man, Fred Sanders is so awesome. Arminian's gross. I'm like, I think you might have missed something there. By the way, Thomas Oden's love for the Christian tradition, the Ancient Christian Commentary series, which he's one of the editors of, is so good. That biography, the autobiography, is excellent as well. I mean, there are so many resources that Thomas Oden wrote that are worth looking at for sure.
And then Justo Gonzalez. I mean, a really good church historian. His 2 volumes on church history are very, well done. They hit the high points, accessible. And I found I had to read this for the class I took on Augustine here, the Mestizo Augustine by Justo Gonzalez. And it was a very fascinating read. I didn't agree with everything in it, but I just thought it was really interesting, some of the points that he sought to bring out. And
I would also mention Timothy Tennant, who's at Asbury Theological Seminary, has written some great stuff on missions, some other really good stuff on evangelical theology and conservative evangelicalism. is a real defender of conservative evangelicalism among Methodists in an age when that's kind of at a premium among some Methodist groups. Ajit Fernando would be another, who's a Sri Lankan minister and theologian commentator. Um, he has a lot of good books on discipleship and ministry and the minister's family. He has a great commentary, I think, on Exodus. He's published a lot with Crossway. That is worth considering. In fact, now that I think about it, Fred Sanders and Ajit Fernando are the two Wesleyan Methodists that have made it under the radar over at Crossway. So they somehow snuck in. When they came out with Wesley on the Christian Life, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And by the way, that book,
we considered it a moment of downgrade, but go ahead.
yeah, I wondered if there was some lamentation in your circles. That book really brings out Fred Sanders' kind of personality. There's a lot of incredible stuff in there. He deals so well with Wesley and his love of First John and all of that. But Sanders is just an excellent writer, and he's obviously dealing with complicated subjects. In most of what he's writing is on the doctrine of the Trinity, but he does so in such a compelling and understandable way. And if you ever get an opportunity to hear Fred Sanders speak at a conference or anywhere else, you really need to. He's fantastic to listen to.
And then we want to close by somebody that I like who's done good stuff is a Lutheran theologian, Rod Rosenblatt. And the book that I referenced earlier that Michael Horton edited, Christ Our Lord, Rod Rosenblatt wrote the concluding chapter, and I have to read a couple of things from him that just really good and encouraging. He said, grace is not even a principle. It is an attribute, a disposition of the living God. He is gracious. To be saved by God's graciousness is to give up on merit, or to use Luther's phrase, to let God be God. Luther believed that to let God be God is to recognize that it is He who does the saving, and part of what is requisite in that is for us to quit trying to do the saving. And then he said, the value then of saving faith is only a value in virtue of the object grasped. Faith itself has no virtue. It connects us to the one who is virtuous. And so I really, I think that these men that we've looked at today, obviously we would have real disagreements with them in issues, but I hope it can remind all of us that even though we're convictional, confessional Baptist, that we also remember that there is a brotherhood that unites us that transcends denominational lines, and much for us to learn from those beyond our tradition.
Absolutely. We probably would be remiss to not mention, thinking about Lutheran theologians, Robert Jensen, who has some great stuff as well. That's worth looking at. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So in all of the ways that we're commending the Baptist tradition and looking at the Baptist story, we are certainly not saying that there's not so much to learn from the broader Christian tradition, and certainly even the Reformed tradition, the Protestant Reformed tradition of the last 500 years, and much that has shaped us individually as people who are interested in history and theology, but also love the church and preaching, and all of those things. So we hold high without any shame or embarrassment the Baptist tradition, but we certainly have learned so much from many others outside of the Baptist tradition as well.
And you might have noticed that we didn't mention any Roman Catholic theologians. I will say on that note, though, I don't know how to say his name right. I think it's Giles Emery, but he is a Roman Catholic theologian whose book on the Trinity is really good. I found it very, very helpful. Now we know Jesse he's an Aquinas guy, and so he can tell you what works of Thomas you should read. That's right, isn't it? Thomistic? Can you be a Thomistic Arminian Baptist? Is that possible?
Well, they would say in the early 17th century that the Arminian Anglicans were sort of crypto Catholics. So there's a connection there.
That's true. All
And
right.
I think
So
Mueller says Arminius is just copying Suarez. So, and I think, so
make
there
sure
you
you
go. Another
pronounce
connection.
it's Mueller. People might think you're saying Moeller. We're talking about Mueller, Richard Mueller.
Yeah.
For y'all that don't know, Jesse's not a huge fan. Anyway. So anyway, this has been. We'll end on that note. So this is generally particular.
I'm a fan of Richard Mueller. I'm just not a fan of his take on Arminius, but we'll save that for another episode.
Okay, whatever you say. All right, and so this is generally particular. Always, we love hearing your comments. Make sure that you tell Jesse what song from Alabama he should include in his next sermon. And until then, even though we've talked about non-Baptists, we do encourage you to stay Baptist.